Chapter 57, Before the Storm. Before the storm. The torches bathed the surrounding buildings in an angry orange light, making the empty windows all the blacker, and Imoen felt as though she was being watched by their sightless eyes. The southern barricade was set about a third of the way down the street, a pile of tables, cupboards, and an old plough that looked to have been well past its best even before the arrow pocks and hatchet scars of 2 nights' siege. It had been one of the worst sides hit, the other being the eastern barricade, where Valigar and Parvatan now stood watch with members of the town militia. Adida, who freely admitted having no combat experience, had joined those less martial citizens serving as messengers coordinating the resistance, all barricades on the 5 streets into the town manned and waiting under a cold gibbous moon. At the end of the street, the plains yawned black and impenetrable, at least to Imoen. She sent a nod to Everard and Falge, the 2 militiamen on guard with them, as she moved closer to the elf who was perched on the sidelong dresser of an overturned cupboard, his eyes fixed on the darkness. She smiled. The torchlight gave his pale skin a golden glow. The glamour was holding, but Solafane was still recognizable even in his new skin. The calm aura of vigilance bred from decades in a place where any lapse could mean death was unmistakable. He seemed to sense her watching, his green eyes narrowing as he returned her gaze.
Enjoying your artistry? Just considering how much closer you are to that skin than you would think, you would never have been able to stand so close to an open flame, let alone see past one.
He shrugged, stepping down to put them on an even level.
The light no longer bothers me as it did, though it is hardly a help at the moment. Once the attack begins, I may move past the barricade and take my fight to the plains. I work better in the darkness, and they will be at a disadvantage.
He smiled, something predatory in his nature shining through.
You may be able to change my appearance, but I am still Drow.
Imoen considered the bitter pride to his words.
You don't like to disguise your birth, do you? No. I spent a lifetime hiding who I am down there, I do not wish to do it up here as well. I will not.
He seemed to realize the emptiness of his defiance, pale fingers flexed before his face.
But for our task, I will bear it. An individual should not burden his comrades with private woes. I get that, I really do,
Imoen continued, not sure of her offer even as it formulated behind her eyes.
But if you plan to travel after all this, you'll find it hard, it could even be dangerous. I could put the same enchantment on a pendant or something if you want, so you could travel with notice, just when you needed to. I thank you for the offer,
he deflected at length, without saying whether he would take her up on it or not. Imoen grinned.
Otherwise, you can just tag along with me. We can go up and down the Sword Coast finding trouble, I'll even let you pick where we go first.
A soft, almost distant smile graced his face as he stepped up and returned his attention to the plains.
Candlekeep.
Imoen felt the pang all through her chest, his stubborn affection was as tender as it was frustrating.
Oh, Sola.
The clatter of armored feet, and Imoen turned to watch Ryan and another man of the militia she had yet to meet materialize at a jog from the darkness of the street behind them. Falge raised a hand in greeting.
Ho, Ryan, Becht, what news? All's quiet to the north and west,
answered Ryan grimily,
but the lookouts on the roofs thought they saw movement to the southeast, so we're warning everyone to be on guard. Does Danton know?
asked Everard.
Yeah, we had to pass him to come here. He's holding position before the hall with a squad of 6 ready to bolster the forces at whichever barricade bears the brunt of the attack. I think the civilians in the hall feel better having them there. Last night, the raiders nearly.
Silence! hissed Solafane, an ear cocked to the plains. Below him, the group froze and suddenly Imoen could hear nothing but the roar of her own blood.
Horses!
The drow snapped suddenly, to the east.
How?
Questioned Ryan. Imoen did not let him finish.
Don't just stand there, get over to the east barricade and warn them.
The two men clattered off. Falge nervously wet his lips and knocked an arrow, Everett doing the same.
Cellophane!
The drow jerked at her voice, his body tense as he strained to hear beyond the roaring silence, his fine amber eyebrows rising slowly up his forehead.
They are gaining speed, they.
A faint roar from the east that ended in a clash of metal that was tinny from such a distance. Every hair on her skin bristled in a shiver. Falge glanced back along the street, but said nothing, and Everett kept his gaze locked straight ahead. They knew they needed to hold the barricade there until ordered otherwise, and Imoen had to remind herself they had had 2 nights to steel themselves in such unfeeling discipline. The moments crept by, an agony of waiting as the clamor of battle echoed along the street behind, and in all their hearts the same doubts: what if they were needed? What if their friends were being overrun? Everett was growing twitchy.
Should we? They've sent no messenger.
Cut in Imoen, trying to silence her own worries as well. Cellophane snorted and braced an arm against the barricade he was standing upon, easily clearing it in one leap.
I'm going over, I'll be useless to you here anyway. Cellophane!
Imoen scrambled to his former perch. The man was below her, gazing up with a serene confidence.
I will bring word.
They parted on a nod and he was gone, hugging the right wall as he raced off into the darkness. Imoen stepped back down to join those left. Falge kept wetting his chapped lips, perhaps he was thirsty, Everett pacing the short length of the barricade. Over the buildings to the east, the inky sky had been scorched to a dark brown by unseen fires. They could have been breached already. Imoen felt her resolve snap.
Everett, I want to report on the eastern barricade. Go.
A hasty salute and he was gone. Falge seemed to edge imperceptibly closer, it was just the two of them now. It began as a rumble to the air, merged and hidden within the clash from the east until it rose above, echoing along the narrow street as a score of horsemen thundered from the darkness before them.
Falge!
His arrow loosed with her scream, and she did not see where hit. Her arms were raised, the powers building white-hot between them that muted all else. A cry beside her, Falge suddenly dropping into cover behind the barricade as a crossbow bolt thudded into his shoulder.
No!
An explosion of scorching white, and fire engulfed the front lines. The air was alive with screaming, horses urged over the writhing fallen to press the attack. Raiders were everywhere, Imoen too fraught defending herself to cast again, Falge doing his best to distract them with his sword held in his offhand, his favor hanging limply at his side. A thud and then another, and she felt the jolts all through her legs as 2 hooks sailed from the horde to bite into the wooden blockade. Imoen ducked the spear thrust and parried another, her short sword drawn and doing all she could to defend herself from the press about her. The barricade was beginning to shift, the old plough leaving deep furrows in the packed earth street as the riders dragged it aside, one of the men screaming insults at his frothing mount.
Come on! Pull, you flea-bitten!
Blood bubbled from his mouth with the shout, his body suddenly slumped in the saddle to reveal the small knife sticking from the back of his neck.
Cellophane!
Imoen had never been so happy to see anyone. The elf had sprung from the edge of the plains, and not as he had left them, his dark skin reflecting like polished ebony in the flames. Whether the cause had been stress from the battle or his own natural resistances, her glamour had failed. Imoen swung out at the second rider, the man dodging her blade, though he had to back off to do so, and the bolt of energy left her hands to knock him clear from his mount. The riderless horses were panicking, straining to escape the chaos, the barricade slowly shifting with their efforts. Imoen scrambled forward, trying to reach the ropes as other riders pressed in to block her, the girl fighting to keep herself from being skewered.
Sola! Get the ropes!
She was not sure if he heard her, but he clearly had some purpose from the way he was charging towards them, dodging spears and swords from those mounted above. A horse reared before him and he swerved left, his pace increased and his last few steps seemed to defy gravity as he pounded up the building to leap off, kicking the nearest rider from his saddle to take his place. The raider trampled beneath his blade high, the drow sliced down once, then twice, the ropes falling limp to the churned ground.
Pull back! Full retreat!
Imoen hurled another explosion of flames after the stampede, and the roar faded to leave an eerie silence. Just as quickly as the raiders had appeared, they were gone, the street left in their wake a carnage of slaughtered bodies, charred and bloody. A lone horse twitched pitifully on the edge of the plains, too injured to rise, yet panicked enough by the dancing flames to make the attempt, the smoldering buildings sending embers skyward in clouds of stars. Solafane was murmuring to his fretting steed, Imoen whipping around at the sound of approaching footsteps. 3 of the militia were pounding down the street, Danton at their head.
We heard they, what in 9 hells is that?
Cried the innkeep, a hand thrown to Solafane. The drow glowered back and made no move to excuse his appearance as Imoen hastened,
It's an illusion, to scare the enemy, that's not important right now. What happened to the eastern barricade?
A familiar voice answered for him, Valigar striding down the street at a pace Parvatan was finding hard to match.
The attack there was just a distraction, a ploy to pull our forces away so the main body of raiders could overrun the barricade here. Well, it looks like you handled yourselves,
offered Danton evenly.
Falch, go back to the hall and get Marion to look at that shoulder. The rest of you, back to your posts, they might just be foolish enough to make another raid too.
Wait, cut in Solafane, the man straightening from where he had been rifling his mount's saddlebag,
you should read this.
Imoen took the square of rough parchment from his unresisting fingers. It had been longer once, the lower edge torn away until the last line was barely legible. Imoen's eyes devoured the angular script.
Increase the number of raids, the men are growing restless and there is little up here to occupy them outside of food. The whole of our force will be gathered in the Galhada Valley by the end of the first 10 days in Elint. Make sure there are supplies there to meet us. We must be prepared when we move against Ofston. Destroy these orders as soon as you have read them. I wonder why he didn't.
Imoen considered aloud. Valigar held his hand out for the note, a thumb run across the rough edge.
Paper can have many uses, from the torn sections I'd say he has been using it as kindling. The Galhada Valley,
murmured Ryan,
that's about 4 days southeast, in the Marching Mountains. So they were supplying an army,
muttered Parvatan,
just like we thought.
Imoen drew herself up, her attention snapping to the Tetheran at her side.
Parvatan, go and find Adida, you need to leave tonight. Take word of this to the Queen's garrison at Ofston and Farn's forces back east, then return to Al-Hali.
She did not wait to see his nod.
Solafane, Valigar, get back to the hall and pack, we need to be ready to leave within the hour. What?
cried Danton.
You can't leave. You promised to help defend the town. I'm sorry, but we have to track them back. We need to know more about this army they're gathering and they could move camp if we don't reach them soon.
The men about them were muttering darkly and for his part, Danton looked furious.
And what if they return? I do not think they will be so eager after such losses,
offered Cellophane.
Besides,
she added hopefully,
the Queen's troops will be here any day now.
Danton seemed to have enough pride not to try and convince her further, the man snorting his anger as he turned his back on her.
I can't stop you, I just hope there's a town left here for them to protect.
They were 3 days into the plains now, another 5 from Al-Hali, their cart slowly rumbling southeast and counter to the steady flow of plodding refugees who shared the roads with them. Anomen gazed back along the way they had already traveled. The wagon's cover had been removed as soon as they had cleared the store mantles, and his seat afforded him a fine view of the coppery gold grasslands that swayed about them at the close of another day. The breeze was from the north, cool and with a hint of rains that would likely never reach them, stirring up dust from the packed earth road in fitful clouds, the motes catching fire in the sinking sun. The dusk was upon them, though they had already an idea of where they would be camping that night, and he turned in his seat to watch the small huddle of buildings rise in the east. It was a village so insignificant the map did not name it, and it seemed it had so far been beneath the notice of Tether's current troubles, too. A group of children were playing a game with a bat and ball on the plains beside it, heads darting up in quick succession to take in their approach. Anomen watched them scamper back into the village like wild rabbits, and by the time the wagon had rumbled to a halt, a small delegation of adults had gathered on the road to greet them. They had most likely assembled to move them on from the stern frowns and prevalence of farming tools brought with them, but once it was realized their company was comprised of priests, the atmosphere became more welcoming. They were directed to the field just to the east of their village and even given a place for their horse in amongst the cows in the local barn. Anomen levered himself upright as the wagon halted its jolting passage over the grassland, people jostling about him unloading bags and tents. The wagon step was narrow, his booted foot finding an unsteady purchase upon it as he gripped the wagon side and slowly lowered his ruined leg to the ground, arms tense for that moment when all his weight would be resting on the weaker limb.
"Do you need a hand there?"
came Benita at his elbow, Anomen thankful he was already down and merely leaning against the wagon to find his feet.
"No, I am fine, it's just a bit stiff." "Sister Rahila said you should have stepped back into the wagon at midday,"
the girl scolded mildly, heaving the pack she had wrestled out onto her shoulder.
"You should listen to your healers." "I'm fine,"
he dismissed again, reaching for the bag she bore.
"Here, allow me."
Benita danced out of reach with a laugh.
"Oh, no, 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 I'll not risk the sister's glare, you go find somewhere to stretch out that leg, we will do this."
Anomen bit back a sigh. To be honest, he had tired himself out with walking earlier. He should have followed Rahila's advice and returned to the wagon, but it had been pleasant walking beside it with the others, feeling the swing of his arms and beat of heart. Even the twinge in his leg that accompanied each step seemed a sign it was healing. As soon as he had resolved to walk, Frithia and Benita had been at his side, giggling and chattering in a way that reminded him of his sister and her friends. In the heat of the plains, Benita had discarded the crisp linen wimple, a simple blue scarf tied over her cropped, dark brown curls, Frithia beside her wearing the tall straw hat she had traded for a kiss back in Indraviat. And the pair had kept him entertained until he had finally succumbed to Rahila's motherly glare and returned to the wagon in the mid-afternoon. Deepak had just finished pitching Anomen's tent by the time he had limped over to help him. The younger man sent him a cheerful nod before rushing off to aid his fellows, and Anomen slumped down before the tent, feeling rather useless in the surrounding activity. Frithia had gone to fetch water from the village well, the girl returning with 2 buckets and an entourage of a half-dozen local children who returned to their game. The last few rays of sun were making their heat felt upon his face. Sheltered, as he was, in the lee of his tent, Anomen had not realized how warm it was seated upon the wagon. He had not bothered with a mirror for a while before they had arrived at Watcher's Keep, and he had been surprised at how tanned his skin had become. It was hardly any different from those hailed from that land. He supposed that spending every day with Fritha, it had been hard to track the change, the girl wearing the same pale face come sun or snow. In the center of their hodgepodge of tents, Rahila and Ombric had gathered the supplies and were doling out rations to the queue that had formed. Fritha's 2 buckets sat beside them, the brothers and sisters washing the dust from their hands at the first and collecting a cup full of the last before moving off to settle before their tents to eat. Anoman was idly mustering the energy to rise and join them, when a familiar shadow fell over him.
"Here we are,"
Benita trilled, passing him a plate of unleavened bread, cheese, dried sausage, and grapes.
"You did not have to." "No, I suppose not,"
she giggled easily, settling beside him without ceremony and leaving Anoman with little option but to thank her and begin his meal. It was the last of their rations, the bread rounds decidedly dry, and he said so, Benita nodding in thoughtful agreement.
"I heard Ivad say we would be pausing outside the town of Sidun tomorrow to resupply. Do you plan to go with them?"
Anoman asked, though he felt he could guess her answer. She had eagerly volunteered to visit every town and village at which they had stopped so far.
"I suppose so,"
came the deflated sign. Anoman just checked his surprise.
"You sound disappointed." "No, it is merely that I have only been to the villages in the foothills of the Stormantles before, and I rather imagined rest of Tethur to be much more exciting. But it seems outside of the towns on the plains, being larger and housing more people, they are not much different."
Benita sighed and ate a grape. Anoman could not help but chuckle.
"What were you expecting?" "I don't know,"
she answered, something lighting in her eyes as she took her mind back there.
"Temples, grand buildings, parks with fountains and flowers. I suppose it was all quite unrealistic now I consider it. I thought perhaps a city would have been closer, but Fritha did not seem to think so. She said both Baldur's Gate and Ithkatla have those things, but they also have slums and crowds and streets upon streets of the same houses you would find in any town." "So Fritha's travelogue has finally departed Candlekeep?" "Yes,"
the girl giggled.
"We are in Ithkatla now. At first Fritha tried to tell me of just the places, but then more creeps in, how she came to see it or what she did there. She has had an eventful life."
On the field before them, Fritha had been roped into the children's game, her stomach flashing white as she leapt up to catch the ball and toss it gently to her teammate.
"And not just Fritha,"
Benita continued,
"you, yourself have had your share of adventures, yes?"
Anoman shrugged, in no mood for reminiscing.
"I suppose I have."
At his side, an odd sigh.
"A battle against vampires, and not just from without, but within your very blood. I cannot imagine the strength of will it took to endure it."
The man could barely splutter a response.
"Wait, Fritha told you that?" "Yes,"
Benita nodded gravely.
"Helm surely must hold you in great regard that, by his will, you survived such an encounter. Fritha told me of your relationship, too."
Benita added casually, though the sly glint of curiosity to her eyes belied her interest,
"of how you were once paired." "I would rather not speak of that, my lady."
Benita nodded mildly and popped the last bite of cheese into her mouth.
"I understand. I do not know how you look back on it, but you made her very happy at a difficult time. I believe Fritha regards the affair fondly."
Anoman glanced inside and was surprised to find he did as well. A shrill whistle split the air. Back at the game, it seemed there had been some complaints that even with only Fritha and the youngest boy making up one side, the teams were unbalanced. Fritha was waving over to them, her face flushed and glowing in the golden light.
"Benita, come and play with us." I don't know the rules,
the girl called back, though she was already on her feet and tying up her skirts to jog over to them. Deepak and Ivad were dragged into the game moments later until every child had an adult, and the game seemed to descend into a chaos of cheating and laughter from then on. Fritha was running to the second marker, the young boy who was her partner bouncing on her shoulders and squealing with laughter as Ivad hiked up his skirts in an attempt to catch them. Anoman let his eyes drift from the shambles of a game to those spectating. The clerics were finishing the last of their meals, laughing and offering applause when points were eventually scored. Rahila was smiling, her dark, wrinkled face seeming somewhat younger for the gesture in Audran. The old man turned to catch his eye, Anoman not quick enough to drop his gaze and pretend he was not looking, though it made little difference. With a stiff nod, Audran turned and crawled inside his tent. It had not been long after their meal that the children were called inside for the night, and their company had gathered in an uneven circle before the wagon to hold evensong. Anoman joined them on occasion. Sometimes his prayers felt like a more private thing, but that evening he had attended as well to sing and offer worship to his Lord. Fritha had made herself scarce just as she had every evening. Perhaps witnessing prayers felt odd when there was a good chance in a 10-day or so you could be listening to supplicants of your own. The camp was shrouded in deep twilight by the time the group disbanded, robed figures heading for their shared tents. Anoman found Fritha before her own, reclined in the grass and plucking idle at the lute she had bought for Solafane, a large bottle resting against her thigh. She glanced up at his approach with a lazy smile.
Checking up on your favorite ball spawn, Anoman.
He winced at her slur, settling next to her.
Please do not call yourself that. Why? I certainly prefer it to my lady.
Anoman laughed in spite of himself, nodding to the bottle she had now taken up.
What have you there? Strawberry wine, I think. I got it back at the village.
The mouthful she drew left her gasping.
It's a bit rough to be honest.
She held it out to him in offer, but he shook his head and she set it back on the grass with a shrug. Her gaze shifted to the field where she had spent the dusk turning cartwheels and playing ball with the other children.
So who won the game? I'm not really sure,
she sighed, swallowing another draught of wine.
Maybe we all did.
Anoman frowned. For all her previous cheer she seemed distant.
Are you well, Fritha?
His concern was enough to bring her round, the girl smiling again as she darted her attention back to him.
What? Yes. We're getting closer, things are readying. I can feel it, like a pulse through the land, or the tang to the air before a storm. A change is coming. Even things I thought within my own power are different. Saravik's gone, I have not seen him since we stopped at the Eyrie. Whenever I visit my plane it is empty. Just tiles and sky. It is disquieting.
As though to curb the feeling, she took another swing of wine, coughing as she swallowed. Anoman didn't have much by way of advice to offer her and settled instead for platitudes.
Well, at least you have your talks with Benita to distract you as we travel. Do I detect a tone of censure?
Fritha teased. Anoman fought the blush. He thought he had managed to quell it.
No, you have volunteered much though, about our adventures about us. Volunteered?
The girl cried incredulously.
Ha! I need only mention a name Benita has not heard before and the questions, it's like being back before Galvary and the Harpers. The poor girl is seriously starved of gossip. You should have seen her glow when I mentioned you and I. And what did you tell her? About us? That we traveled together in and found a place for each other in our lives which could have taken us past such adventures, had circumstance not divided us. Makes it sound much more romantic, the truth, doesn't it? One party at the order and a single kiss upon the plains. There were 2 kisses,
he corrected, suddenly grinning like an idiot. Frithla looked puzzled.
2. Yes, I kissed you on the plains, you kissed me in Sultanasseller.
News to Frithla, it seemed.
I did. In the battle, before we parted in Elisim's palace.
A moment to recall it, and Anomen watched the grin spread across her face to match his own, Frithla looking thoroughly pleased with herself.
So I did. Good, I should have screwed up my courage and kissed someone before I die, and I'm glad it was you.
She slapped his leg in friendly punctuation of this triumph and sank a cheerful mouthful.
You've never kissed Solafane?
Anomen confirmed curiously. Frithla shook her head.
No, not on the mouth anyway.
She corrected with an embarrassed chuckle, the bottle tipped back for another wistful gulp.
Ah, my beautiful Sola. Look after him for me, won't you? Take him back to Athkatla and be his brother.
Anomen nodded tiredly,
I can do that. Good,
Frithla sighed, lifting the bottle to her lips as she shifted closer to rest her head upon his shoulder.
Set him up with dozens of girls, and get him drunk and sing with him. And that will help, will it? Maybe, sometimes when the world is against you and the fates have set their course, all you can do is drink and sing.
She smiled and held the bottle out to him. The usual warnings and admonishments tumbled through his mind. But perhaps she did not need lectures or disapproval just then, perhaps she just needed an ally. He took up the bottle with a grin.
All right, but I won't be joining in the singing.
Frithla just laughed.
We'll see.
They followed the trail all that night, a cold dawn finding their 3 stepping from the grasslands onto the rocky slopes of the foothills, the marching mountains towering above them, snow-peaked and impenetrable against the southern sky. The climb was not hard, the tracks keeping mostly to a scree path that followed a narrow stream up through gorges and valleys, and it was as day was drawing to close that Solafane caught the sound of voices on the cooling air. They left the horses there. They had been leading them for most of the day anyway, the 3 mounts tethered to a lone hawthorn tree while they crept away from the tracks to approach from the southeast, where a scrubby wood of cypress and blackthorn found purchase in the arid soil. The camp itself was nestled in the shallow dip between 2 hillocks. 4 sentries were holding position on the slopes surrounding it, 2 on either side, the forest that concealed Imoen and the others running right up to the southern ridge of the hollow. Imoen hunkered down in amongst the scrubby bushes on the wood's edge, the camp but a few paces further down the slope before them. It looked much larger than would have been required for the number of men currently there, 70 of tents to serve the dozen or so raiders who were gathered about a large fire pit in the center of the site. Half of them seemed to be nursing wounds, mostly burns, a robed man with a mace at his belt tending 3 of the more badly injured on pallets brought out into the fading sunlight. They had not killed that many in the attack on Jera, and it seemed more likely that a camp of this size was the base for all the attacks along the Aegis, raiders coming and going as needed. Imoen scanned the clearing. There were no carts, nor any goods awaiting transport that she could see. Had they already been moved on to Galhada?
Something is not right, hissed Valigar behind her. Where is the livestock they took? Danton spoke of losing 20 head of cattle, yet there is no sign of it here. Slaughtered perhaps, for ease of transport,
offered Solafane. Imoen was frowning.
Maybe, though it makes more sense to keep it alive, meat will spoil quickly in this heat. Could they be keeping the livestock elsewhere?
Solafane was not listening though, his head turned away and tilted back as he sniffed the air.
Do you smell that?
Neither of the humans did, though they trusted the drow enough to follow him, Solafane leading them along the ridge further into the gnarled woodland. It was just a trace to the air at first, the sour fetid reek growing stronger with each step. Up ahead, there was a break in the ground, a wide fissure that Solafane reached first and from which he hastily backed away. Imoen held a sleeve up to her nose, the drow looking as though he was fighting not to gag as the scent wafted up from the gully beneath, where everything from flour sacks to vegetable had been thrown in and left to rot. In Imoen's stomach, an unnamed dread was rising with the bile.
The supplies they raided,
confirmed Valigar from behind his hand.
Perhaps it had already begun to turn before they could transport it east,
offered Solafane. Imoen wished it was so, her gaze pulled back to the camp she could just see filtering through the low branches.
Something's not right here. We need to know more. We are outnumbered here at least 4-1,
warned Valigar, seemingly guessing her intent.
And how many more could be concealed within the tents?
Imoen shrugged, something about his worrying always made her feel brash.
Magic will even those odds.
The man snorted but said nothing. The fact he did not even try to talk her out of it made Imoen feel strangely worse, as though he had already given up. Solafane, however, remained focused on the practical.
Fire could destroy any evidence held within, as could most of the creatures you could summon. Yeah, I don't fancy searching the wreckage after some stone elementals charged through. I could take out the sentries,
the drow continued.
That would even the numbers.
Valigar nodded, crouching to get a better view of their target.
After which, we could regroup and attack from 3 sides to take the main fire pit. We would more than have our enemies in one strike. Agreed,
announced Imoen.
Solafane.
He left them with a nod, the man creeping back around to the north. The first guard was the simplest, his position on the forest's edge made him easy prey, and the drow worked his way slowly along the western slope to take out his partner before doubling back. His faded yellow cloak provided more concealment against the parched ground than Imoen would have expected. It was like watching a predator at work, the way he crept closer, body bent so low to the ground it seemed he should not have been able to move at all, while any second his prey could turn and sound the alarm. Closer, closer, and then he struck, Imoen holding her breath for that an instant of silent struggle, before the body went limp and Solafane was dragging his kill back to the cover of the trees.
Come,
murmured Valigar, as Solafane took out the last man,
we should get into position.
They moved as one, following the forest as far as they could along the western slope, before leaving its cover. Imoen kept as low as she could, Valigar signaling for them to start down the slope into the camp proper after a few yards. It was easier to move once in the shadow of the tents. She and Valigar split almost immediately, the man continuing his way along the western edge while she moved into position to the south behind one of the larger pavilions. Behind the tents to the east, she sensed rather than saw Solafane. Soon they would be ready for their 3-pronged attack. From his crouched position behind a weapons rack, Valigar nodded, Imoen trusting the drow was similarly ready as she raised her hands, her spell would be the signal. A rustle from the tent to her right. Time seemed to slow, the merc's cry sounding mere seconds before the spell left her hands.
Alarm! We're under a,
His scream coughed up a lungful of blood and it spattered her face in a warm rain as her short sword found its way under his cuirass. Her spell had been complete, but not at full force and the campfire was in chaos, men who should have been left reeling, leaping to arms. Valigar and Solafane had broken cover and were charging into the melee, and Imoen was forced to abandon her next spell and race to join them. From the tents about them, more men were stirring from their rest, another half-dozen piling into the fray about them. Imoen parried a sword sweep, her offhand thrown out to floor her opponent with a bolt of light. At her back, the Solafane and Valigar were holding together. Perhaps they could do this, perhaps they would. The cleric before her fainted left, her spell deflected by one of his own, and her weight was unprepared for the vicious swipe of his mace. Suddenly she was falling, the mace plummeting towards her. A scream left her throat and Valigar's shout split the air.
Imoen!
A flash, and it was as though someone had sucked all the air from her lungs as she hit the uneven ground. Her chest felt tight and Imoen braced for that explosion of pain, only it did not come. Someone was still screaming, and it was a surprise to realize it was not her, strong hands making her jump as she was grasped under the arms.
Imoen, we need to get back.
Sola! She gasped, his face unfocused above her, the gravel prickling her back as he dragged her clear.
What's going?
The question died on her lips. Valigar was standing, hunched and trembling, wreathed in a darkness that swirled like mist, fine tendrils branching from him to weave a gauzy dome of black, and in it were suspended the mercs. Imoen could not draw her eyes away. The way they twitched like a dozen or more spiders, half their limbs already torn away by in some spiteful child's game, and they writhed in stiff-limbed agony as the smoke choked mouths and snaked up nostrils, suffocating them from within. One by one, they stopped moving and the veil of energy finally faded to let them drop, dead about him.
By the nine hells,
Imoen breathed, gazing about her as though the carnage was too much to take in all at once. On the edge of the circle, her gaze caught on his hunched form. Her feet took a step towards him.
Vals! Don't touch me!
He snarled over his shoulder, something in his stance flinching.
Stay back!
Imoen said no more, returning to where Solafane was picking his way across the bodies when the drow suddenly dropped to an urgent crouch.
Here! One survived!
She closed to him, her breath catching as the body he was stooped over slowly came into view. His golden hair was matted with blood and the warm sallow skin had paled so close to death as he was, and yet he was unmistakable.
Hazel! You know him?
Asked Solafane.
We met in Amcathran at the tavern. He was one of the mercs gathered there, he took a shine to Fritha. You mean, Freya?
The man sneered, drawing breath for the words painful enough to leave him gasping.
Yes, I recognize you, Ballspawn. Pretending you were just more of Melisand's strays when all along your sister was a member of the Five. We never tried to trick you, well, not properly,
Imoen conceded, forging past her half-truths to press.
Listen to me, Hazel, we aren't members of the Five, and we don't want to bring Ball back. Balthazar has lied to you. And the bounty notices lie, do they? The reports from the Tetheran army? Your sister's slaughter at a fort back east along the river. It wasn't a fort, it was a prison for the children, and what of you?
She accused.
Balthazar has had you raiding all the villages east of the old capital. A necessary distraction,
he wheezed.
We kept the killings to a minimum, we needed only to drive the people out, and once you and your cursed sister have fallen, Queen Zernda will see reason and join our cause. The Ballspawn will be removed and there will be no more bloodshed. Of course,
scoffed Imoen,
except for the slaughter of 1,000 or so children, but what do we matter? Why are you doing this, Hazel? Why the raids? Why steal all this food only to let it rot?
For the first time, Hazel was smiling, something of that charm returning to his otherwise plain face. Imoen felt suddenly ill.
It is too late,
he coughed, blood speckling his chin.
You can't stop him. You'll never reach her in time. What?
Imoen choked, the horror stealing her voice.
What is too late? Who do you mean?
One last fractured breath, his smile widened.
Alhali. Damn you, Hazel, tell me.
Solophane's hand landed gently on her shoulder.
Mon, he is dead.
She kicked his body with a curse, the tightness in her chest increasing with every breath as that sense of crippling failure took hold. They had been so close. She had found an army, freed the silver chalice, and for what? So she could send them to the other side of Tethur, while some unknown danger marched on the very heart of their resistance.
Mon.
She nodded, mopping away the tears as she straightened at last to face the man beside her.
I know, we don't have time for it. We need to get back to Alhali and warn them before it's too late.
Solophane squeezed her shoulder in acknowledgement of her weak smile, Mon turning to find the last of their company still standing alone on the edge of the carnage, his back to them. She wanted to approach, to comfort him as Solophane had her, but she could not.
Vals.
She ventured softly. Silence answered her.
Valigar.
His shoulders jerked at her snap. Slowly he turned to them, his face a mask she had not time just then try to read.
You heard what Hazel said?
She confirmed, not waiting for his nod to set out for the horses. The tension in her stomach was like a fist about her gut. Hazel's words had been vague, but the meaning seemed all too clear to her. Balthazar marched on Alhali. They rode without pause, the high sun slowly sinking before them as they headed west. The long grass whipped by under his stirrups, his body rolling with the easy canter of his horse, until Solophane felt as though he had been riding forever, tripping across a golden sea, the occasional farm or village rising from the depths like dark islands. Ahead the sun was barely cresting the horizon, dusk chasing them into the sunset. Approaching on the plain before them, a bare patch of dusty earth made a hollow clearing in the grasses. Likely a pool in wetter months, the arid bed was cracked and parched by the long summer's heat. Valigar had the lead, Solophane expecting the man to steer his mount on a course along the edge, and he was surprised when he slowed the creature to walk it gently into the hollow itself.
Here,
announced Valigar, bringing his mount to a halt,
we should make camp here, the dip in the land will conceal us.
He swung easily from the saddle, Mon staring down at him as though she could not believe her eyes.
What? Vals, we need to press on. You heard Hazel, they could already be at Alhali.
But the man just shrugged.
If Balthazar's army is already there, then there is little we can do. We all need to rest after the last few hours, and riding in the dark is dangerous for both us and the horses. We can remain here until just before the dawn, then set out again, losing only a few hours. But...
The girl was looking back and forth between Valigar and the still-mounted Solophane, torn between frustration and fear. Solophane waited for the side words of reassurance, but they did not come, Valigar silent as he turned his attention to his pack. With a frown, the drow stepped in.
Mon, I know Hazel put in your mind these thoughts of an army marching relentless across the plains, but to stay hidden, they will likely be forced to travel under cover of darkness and take a less direct route. We can move much faster than they and will not be similarly restricted, we will outpace them yet.
She sighed and nodded, all the fight suddenly leaving her as she slid from her saddle.
I'll see to the horses. You two pitch the tents.
It did not take long to make their meager camp. There would be no fire, the light was a liability and, as it was, they had no wood. Mon had tethered the horses to the gnarled root of a tree that had long since been felled from the bank, their tents pitched easily in the crumbling earth. Mon and Valigar were standing together now, the closeness of their bodies belying their weary stance as Imoen gestured to the tent beside them. Valigar nodded once and Solafane saw his cue.
I think I will go out into the grasslands and set some traps. We will make even better time back to Al-Hali, if we do not need to stop for supplies.
Imoen heaved off her boots, barely crawling one step before collapsing into the bedding with a groan that was nearly all sigh, and she could hardly muster the energy to move over when Valigar crawled in after her. For a while, they just lay there in silence, one pane of the canvas peak above them aflame in orange, the other grey with the changing light outside. Imoen lingered on the edge of sleep, listening to the sound of his breathing and the sighing grass outside. Only an inch or two separated their shoulders, but the gulf between them was immeasurable. She contemplated instigating a coupling, if only as a last-ditch effort to connect them, but what would be the point? The point? What had been the point of even beginning the thing? And with the question she was suddenly awake and aware of it, the long-held grain of fierce affection she had always held for him. First sparked in the tavern in Marmont so many months ago, sealed with their night together in Indravayat, and built upon since with every fond gesture until it was something. And it was something that was worth saving. Imoen eased herself up to sit beside him in the gloom.
Vals.
Yes, came the answer, prompt and without a hint of sleep. Imoen drew a stealing breath.
I think we need to talk. I think we need to be honest about what we want and what we are going to do to deal with what is happening between us. I know you've been facing a lot lately and that you're worried, but if we're open, then I know we can work through this.
His silence prodded her forward. Well, it was only fair she start.
All right, then, so I've been studying magic behind your back.
It took real effort to prevent the words tumbling together into something unintelligible, her excuses fast on their heels.
I was worried you'd be frightened by how easily it comes to me, and it does, I know, because of the taint, so I hid it. I'm sorry. I don't want to lie to you anymore. We can't afford to have anything driving us apart.
Not when we're doing such a good job of that ourselves, she added silently. Imoen was braced for the resulting explosion, but the man next to her said nothing. His profile was clear in the half-light, the deep forehead sweeping down into the strong nose, his beard unkempt from days on the move. His eyes were closed and she wondered how she had not noticed before his long dark eyelashes.
Vals.
The silence was almost deafening. Imoen felt the tension snap, fighting the desire to push him roughly away from her.
Well, say something. Get angry. Anything.
Imoen, he sighed, at last, his voice catching, and her hopes of the usual weary apology died then.
I cannot do this anymore.
Imoen's emotions went through an immediate about-face, suddenly wanting nothing more to pull her to him in her rising dismay.
Oh, Vals, no. I am sorry,
he continued, dull and unmoved, the man sitting to face her.
When it was just your magic when we were studying together, I thought I could accept it. But now I can see it is impossible. I cannot watch you grow in power and guard against your corruption, when I will have to be so focused in guarding against my own.
Imoen could barely manage to force a reply past the suffocating lump in her throat.
Vals, please, if you're going to end this, at least, let it be for the taint or the war or because I lied. Not this. Not for such a stupid reason, born of beliefs you began to question even after your mother was killed. Magic isn't going to corrupt me and it won't corrupt you. I don't care if you want to suppress your magic, Vals, don't use it, forget you even have it, but you don't have to fear it. Acceptance breeds complacency, he pressed firmly. I tried to ignore it. This day was not the first time I have cast.
No, she sneered, you saved me from the rock slide outside Sendai's fortress, how evil.
I am surprised you can even live with yourself.
Valigar seemed to swell until he filled the entire tent.
Not then. I speak of thine gate when I stood in an alley, and, mostly wholly against my will, drained the life from a terrified guardsman. His body withered to a husk before my eyes, dark magics of which even Lavak would have been proud.
Imoen tried to turn her gasp into sigh.
Vals, that doesn't mean.
He could not let her finish.
Besides,
he cut in more calmly, though his haste to interrupt her reassurances stung,
my link to the weave affects more than merely that. I cannot continue my line now, not when this poison is carried in my blood.
He caught her with an unyielding look.
You would never know the blessings of a family. So? I don't want a kid now. But you will one day. Don't say that.
She exploded.
You don't know that. How can you, when I don't even know that? Everything you've said, it's all just excuses. Only one thing matters to me, how we feel now. Why isn't that enough?
He had no answer for her, the girl drawing a deep breath to press.
Vals, I love you. I know it feels like we're dying, that it's over and out of our control, but it's not if we don't want it to be.
He would not even look at her, all his focus on the crumpled hand that rested upon his thigh.
I am sorry, Imoen, I cannot.
Imoen grabbed up her bag, misery choked back in that wave of blistering anger.
Fine. Sit in your narrow little world and live a long narrow life in it. May the idea you clung to your ridiculous principles give you some comfort in the dark.
She struggled to a crouch, the bedding tangling roughly about her feet as she fought the few steps to the tent flap, just enough control left to stifle the welling tears for her parting shot.
You will regret me, Valigar Korthala.
Solifane took much longer than was required setting the traps. He knew why his companions had retired and they deserved some privacy. He pushed through the long grass to step down into their dusty clearing. The camp was empty, no sound of the encounter he has worked to avoid, or indeed, anything else, was emanating from Valigar's tent, while from his own. He crouched uncertainly before the tent flap, the muffled sobs breathy and high.
Imoen. Bugger off.
The voice hiccuped angrily.
Imoen, are you?
He pushed aside the tent flap. Imoen curled upon his bedding, a cup in one hand and an half-empty bottle of wine lolling on the pillow next to her, her face blotchy and glistening with tears. Solifane's stomach sank, suddenly realizing that it had been pointless to confirm she was upset when he had no idea of how to proceed.
I am sorry, I will leave you alone. No, it's fine,
Imoen sighed, drawing a long mouthful of wine.
You can stay, as long as you're willing to subscribe to the fact that all men are bastards.
Solifane smiled weakly.
I think I may be able to concede that point without too many sources for objection.
Imoen gave a snotty laugh.
Ah, come in. It's your tent after all. Sorry I invaded, Vals and me had a fight and...
A broken sob staggered her confession.
We aren't together anymore.
Solifane was not sure what to say, he settled on the truth.
Then the loss is his.
Imoen offered him a watery smile, tears dislodged to flow freely down her face.
Ah, I like you, Sola, have I told you how much I like you?
She did not ask if he wanted any wine, the girl fishing another cup from her pack to pour him some before drawing another large gulp of her own. Solifane watched fresh tears roll unheeded across her cheeks.
Do you wish to talk about it? About what?
She countered tiredly.
He can't be the man I want and I can't be the girl he needs. I don't even think me giving up my studies would make a difference now.
Imoen rolled her puffy eyes dramatically.
Men,
she sighed, giving Solafane a knowing look as though they both knew what fickle and frustrating creatures they were, and he smiled tentatively.
I suppose I should have seen it coming,
Imoen continued.
He tried to change, but after his hand and his own magic surfaced, I guess it was all too much. And now Balthazar's marching on Al-Hali, I can't believe I was so stupid. This was not your fault,
he insisted. Imoen sighed gently.
I know. So what about you, Sola?
She sniffed, mopping clumsily at her face.
You ever broken a girl's heart?
Solafane drew a sip of the wine, letting it linger on his tongue a moment before swallowing. It was sharp like the memories.
No, I do not believe Pharaoh was in possession of one, and Frithis was already beyond repair when I found her.
Considering the amount of wine she had knocked back, Imoen caught him with a remarkably lucid look.
You're in love with her, aren't you?
Imoen sighed deeply at his downcast frown and squeezed his arm.
Sola, ignoring it won't make any difference. Won't it?
Imoen laughed wetly.
Gods, you and her deserve each other.
Solafane shook his head, feeling old regrets surface anew.
I cannot, not again. I told her I could not. Look,
snorted Imoen,
you can tell her, you can tell me, you can tell the whole world if you like, but it won't change how you feel. Solafane, do you honestly think you could miss her any more than you are going to? You should enjoy the time you have together. To what end? End,
she sighed, looking down into her half-empty cup.
Such a final word. I know you feel the time that's left won't be worth it, but it will.
She pressed a hand to her chest.
In here. I'll make you a deal, Sola, you tell Fritha how you feel and I'll.
Imoen took a large gulp of wine, wincing as she swallowed.
I'll tell her I forgive her. Do you? Yeah,
she nodded wearily.
I really do. She changed and I resented the distance between us. But she had to. This role, this life, this blood demands it. I know that now.
Solafane smiled slightly, Imoen's grin more lopsided from the wine.
You know, you truly are a fine leader.
The girl just shrugged and drew another large gulp.
Well, there has to be one thing I'm good at, and it sure as hells isn't boyfriends.
Imoen drank the rest of bottle to herself and Solafane left her sleeping fitfully in his tent. Laid on the hard ground before it, the sky seemed vast, a golden field edged with a fading pink to the east and deepening lavender to the west. It was beautiful, but fleeting, just as so many other things. Soon the stars would be wheeling above him, and he was brought back to the time he had painted Frith's henna in those first few days after she had made her decision to stay and accept her fate. It was painful, the knowledge nothing lasted forever, even more painful when he considered this really was their last chance. It was selfish of him, perhaps she would find things easier to let go of without such entanglements, but then perhaps she would find it hard whatever held her there. He glanced back to his tent, considering whether he could fetch out Frith's lute without disturbing Imoen. His prayer song still eluded him, but to feel the polished wood smooth under his hands and to know she had held it similarly was a comfort. Before he could decide either way, the steady beat of footfalls caught his attention and he sat up to find that tall silhouette tramping easily through the grasses to the east, haloed by the violet dusk. Valigar nodded to Solafane, casting an unnecessary eye over the camp to ask,
"Where is Imoen?" "In my tent asleep. I do not think she would appreciate being woken,"
Solafane added quickly, as the man made a step towards the canvas peak.
"She has been drinking."
Valigar muttered something under his breath, but it was not so quiet that the drow could not pick it up.
She is unhappy. If you are so concerned with acting responsibly, then perhaps you should have waited to break with her until after we had returned to Alhali. This is none of your business,
growled Valigar, the man taking a step back as Solifane sprang to his feet.
Then do not make it so. You lectured me regarding Fritha and her secrets, but how are you any better? You lied to us all about this magic you possess. You spoke of worries of being a burden to our group, yet you have this power at your disposal that you refuse to employ. For the last 10 days, I have turned my hand to every foreign tool in Alhali, building, repairing. No magic I posses could have helped there.
Valigar dismissed angrily. Solifane swiped the excuses away.
I do not care. You lecture me on what I would or would not have sacrificed for Tethur, but you are the same. You will be near useless in the coming battle. Had you admitted and acted upon this and let Imoen train you, we could have added another mage to our forces.
Valigar looked as though he wished to lash out, his fists clenched and chest heaving.
I would only become another danger were I to succumb to this darkness. You have no proof of that, you speak only from fear. You are frightened of magic, of what you have decided it has done to your family, because if magic is not to blame, then the corruption was merely theirs. What if, Valigar?
Solifane leaned in, his voice suddenly quiet.
This darkness you attribute to magic is merely within you? And you are terrified of Imoen, of finding something that will make you question your beliefs and face your fears.
Solifane shook his head, his disgust evident.
You are coward. You.
Valigar's hand lashed out, Solifane not bothering to dodge when it was so far away, and the black bolt of light caught him by surprise. The ground was hard, the pain all through his back and chest easily ignored as he croaked out a chuckle, and struggled to his feet to face the man's horrified expression.
You saw it then, this corrupting power that I cannot control. You cannot control it, Valigar,
Solifane gasped, still winded from the blow, though he kept his tone conciliatory.
Because you have not tried, you have never tried. Be it your parents, Imoen, or yourself, you merely ignore any problem and pretend it is not there. Accept guidance in these powers, and stop running from who you are. You expect me to listen to you, drow?
Valigar snapped, holding the offending hand out from him as though he would like nothing better than to sever it at the wrist.
For lifetimes you have on me, tell me, what did you run from when you followed us up here?
Solifane drew back, 1,000 fleeting recollections as tortured and torturer rendering him almost speechless, and when he found his voice again it was chilled by the memories.
I know just what I am, and what I have done and what was once done to me. I wake up each day and face up to who I was, and vow not to waste this chance to be better. Do the same, Valigar. Accept who you are, accept it and move forward. What's going on?
Came a small and decidedly groggy interruption beside them. Imoen was crouched in the mouth of his tent, a hand to her, no doubt, aching head. Solifane sighed, in that moment, she could have so easily been her absent sister.
Nothing, Imoen, return to sleep, we will need to be back on the horses soon enough.
Solifane followed her as she made to crawl back inside, the man reaching into the left corner to grab the strap of the loot case he knew he had deposited there. Behind him, Valigar was glowering at his back, the drow ignoring the glare to turn on his heel and head out into the grasslands. There would be no prayer song tonight either, but perhaps he could still find some peace, Illustre willing. End of chapter.